So welcome everyone to the first annual Indigenous Peoples Day celebration at Vermont Law School. It's a big day. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Hillary Hoffman, and I teach Native Americans in the law in the spring at VLS. So if you're interested in any of the issues that we're talking about today, perhaps you might want to join us in that class in the spring. And I'm also the faculty advisor to the Native American Law Students Association. So again, if you're interested in any of the issues that are discussed today, you should consider joining NALSA and helping their efforts. Before introducing the speakers, I wanted to mention how we came to be sitting here today celebrating this day. Last year, several VLS NALSA students drafted a resolution to change the law school's recognition of Columbus Day to the recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day. They presented it to the faculty at a faculty meeting. The faculty voted unanimously to adopt the resolution, and then the administration approved that change. It happened really quickly and with a ton of support, but it would not have happened without the students taking those initiatives. So one of them is sitting next to me on the panel today, so you're going to hear from her a little bit more about that. So our two speakers are going to talk about several current environmental issues involving Indigenous communities, both in the U.S. and internationally. We have first Cedar, right? So Cedar Wilkie Gillette is a third-year law student at VLS. She focuses on environmental law and policy here at the law school. Before law school, she was a grassroots advocate who spearheaded the first tribal fracking ban on her mother's reservation, the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, in North Dakota. Cedar is an enrolled member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, which is her father's tribe, right? She is going to be speaking to us about various current environmental issues, including the Dakota Access Pipeline, which many of you have probably heard about in the news. And then we have Professor Betsy Baker, who's an expert in all things Arctic. She's going to be discussing, well, first I'll say she's an expert in international environmental issues affecting the Arctic, specifically focusing on natural resource development and Arctic governance. She teaches international environmental law and comparative law at VLS, and I'll let her introduce her topic actually because it's fairly specific. So they're each going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have some questions at the end for about 15 to 20 minutes. Bill Bond is recording our session, so he's asked that before you speak, you wait till there's a microphone delivered to you so that we can record the questions and the answers. So without further ado, here's Cedar.
Buju nin Cedar Indigenous Alchawisha Indigo Ushki und Nag Vermont Inda Nimi Guchimin Wendam Bi Mino Gidad Diziwen. I just introduced myself in one of my traditional languages, Ojibwe. I normally don't do that because I'm usually the only speaker in the room to understand it. But I told you my name is Cedar. My Indian name is Mountain Woman. My clan is Crane. I am from Newtown, but I live in Vermont. And I am happy to be here and have this good life. And thank you for being here today. So we are hosting this panel today because Indigenous Peoples Day will happen on Monday, the 10th. And there was a debate in our executive board of how to spell Indigenous Peoples Day. So that's why I have it all slashed that way. And Jackie, our vice president, came up with the brilliant idea of having a 50-50 raffle so that you can vote of where the apostrophe goes or if it doesn't go there for peoples. And we have jars at that table there. It's $1 ticket and 3 for $5, I believe, is the price if you are interested in getting in that. And we are fundraising to go to the Federal Indian Law Conference next April in Arizona. if it works.
Oh, point it at the, I think at the computer. Yeah. Do you want me to get started?
Or wait. Okay, so why we wanted Indigenous Peoples Day. We wanted to acknowledge the true history of this continent. Christopher Columbus didn't just come over in 1492 and America became America. There was millions of people here with distinct cultures and languages and tribes and societies that seem to be glossed over today in history books. And even here at the law school, as a 1L, you're not required to know what happened to the Native Americans. When you're in property, they teach Johnson v. McIntosh, and the concept of property is the legal fiction legitimizing taking away Native lands and putting it into the United States Trust. So it's really, I remember being a 1L, just not satisfied the way that it was explained, to say that we just assimilated into the mainstream culture and we helped the pilgrims and then our role in this country was done. And I'll go more into that. So from having hundreds of millions of people to being only 1% of the American population today, I feel very fortunate to be here, to speak to you and to learn the law. Columbus Day became a federal holiday in 1934, and we would like to point out that during that time, Native Americans didn't even have the right to vote, so they didn't have a voice to oppose this interpretation of history. And these are the places before 2015 and in 2015 that have adopted Indigenous Peoples Day. As of last night, Phoenix adopted it, and they were the largest city to do so far. Other places, like Evanston, Illinois, Yakima, Washington, just this grassroots effort to change the day, city to city or state to state. There's some states that don't recognize it. And as Hillary mentioned, Professor Hoffman mentioned that we came together in our NALSA group last year, and a year today, we decided to start tabling in the breezeway to collect signatures of support to change the day. And it was good because it was only 3 days and we collected over 130 signatures, but it allowed us to talk to people, and people could ask why did we want to change the day, or a lot of people didn't think that Columbus Day was offensive, or never even occurred to them that it could be offensive. So that's another reason why it was good to change the day, so that we could create a space to talk about it. And then the following week, we presented the signatures to the SBA and asked for their letter of support to change the day. And they had some debate, but decided to support us. And the following week, we came back again, and they drafted a final version of their letter of support. And this portion of it is, to me, it captures why we did this work. The name change raises awareness of issues that Indigenous communities face around the world today, and shows our students with Native American heritage that Vermont Law hopes to create the best environment for them possible. And we also received letters of support from the faculty, the Women's Law Group, and the Black Law Students Association. And then we presented all of this to Dean Jefferson and the administration and requested that this day be on the academic calendar. And we did this in a month. So it was great momentum, and I love that the campus was really receptive, and everyone seemed genuinely supportive of our efforts. So getting back to being a Native American law student, I just wanted to point out some other things. That in 2015, there was only 2,640 Native American lawyers, which is 0.2% of more than 1.2 million attorneys in the United States. And what I alluded to before about learning property law and not knowing the tribal perspective, a majority of attorneys don't know, don't know the accurate history, I would say. I would put it that way. And to point out like how much we are underrepresented in the law community, is that there's never been a Native American president or a Supreme Court justice, and only in 2014 was Diane Humetewe from Arizona confirmed as the first Native American federal court judge. So she's the only Native American that would be eligible to be appointed to the Supreme Court, and that was only in 2014. And so I'll transition to the Dakota Access Pipeline, which has, I'm from North Dakota, and it's a very conservative state. They've never seen this type of action before, I can say that. The direct action, the thousands of people that have come together, has never happened before. The hundreds of tribes that came together, and on the face of it, it is against this one pipeline, and some people have criticized, like, why are you just against this one pipeline? But they're not. They're looking at the big picture. Like, this pipeline is crossing the Missouri River. And what the chairman of Standing Rock said yesterday at this press conference, because they were in court at the D.C. circuit for their injunction to stop one portion that is near the reservation line. And their argument is that they were not adequately consulted from the federal agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers. They had a duty to consult with the tribe before allowing the route to happen. And they are not being violent. They're doing direct action. There's a lot of prayer and ceremonies. My parents went to the camp today, actually, and they're dropping off donations. But my parents are not from this tribe, but it created a space for all of this solidarity and to actually talk about the different issues that North Dakota in general are not dealing with, because they've been fracking since 2010. And where I'm from, where my dad's reservation is from, the Mandan Hidatsa Nation, we're in the heart of it. And this pipeline is 17 miles away from my hometown. So what the government is saying, like, fracking is, the greatest thing since sliced bread, like, it's bringing all this money and all these jobs. but it's contaminating a lot of water. Duke University last year was the first, did the first research study since the start of the fracking happening to study if the brine spills, like the fracking waste, or either from pipelines or just spilling in general from the fracking process, if those spills were cleaned up, and a majority of them have not. And there's no one monitoring the air. There's no one issuing fines for water contamination. 2 years ago, there was a 1 million gallon brine spill into the Missouri River, but it started on the reservation. So people, there was no agencies that came to our aid to try to mitigate that, or and it's been 2 years and it hasn't been cleaned up. So just different issues like that is all connected to what they're trying to do now. And this was a image that I got from Winona LaDuke, one of the lead environmentalists, saying that it's not just this pipeline, it is all this infrastructure that taking the oil from North Dakota and creating all of this, that it's not just impacting me in my hometown or just Standing Rock, but it's impacting all of these people. But I could talk about it for a while, so I won't. I will. I just wanted to mention those things, that people at Standing Rock are very mindful of what they're trying to achieve just in their own backyard, so to speak, but also speaking to all of this. It's not just this pipeline that they're fighting. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Cedar. And now we'll hear from Professor Betsy Baker. Maybe.
There we are. Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Cedar, for that really good overview of a lot of very, very critical issues. I'm fortunate to live most of the year in the state of Alaska. Our lieutenant governor is Byron Malott, who is Tlingit. He's the first lieutenant governor of Alaska Native heritage. The Tlingit tribe took one of its traditional, I want to say 20-person canoes by trailer down to Standing Rock. And they are there in prayer and in solidarity. Alaska Natives make up 13% of the population in Alaska. Alaska Native corporations are the economic driver of the state, second to oil, and that's still a substantial number of dollars and jobs and foundation work. So there are many, many problems in the state of Alaska with Alaska Native relations to the state and consultation with the federal government, but there are also many bright spots. I'll just say another word about Johnson v. McIntosh, which I have the difficulty of teaching when I do teach property. And something that changed my perspective tremendously was attending an Arctic conference about 7 years ago. And John B. Zoe, who's the chief of the Clicho Nation in the Yukon, masterful, gets up and says, so you guys have fee simple. Right? So think of lines and rights and grids. He said, we sit with the land. We are with our land year round. We are there in every season. We track, we know, we live and breathe with our land, and we care for it. And to me, that's been just a really humbling and wonderful lens through which to see the American legal tradition in which I was raised, with very little awareness of many of the issues that Cedar speaks of. I come to you today to humbly, again, offer what I have learned from the privilege of working with the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And the first opportunity I had to do that was with Vermont Law students in the Institute for Energy and Environment. And we were asked by the Inuit Circumpolar Council to do a comparison of oil and gas regulation in Greenland and Russia. We had already done a paper on Canada and the United States, and so the focus was particularly on Indigenous rights in Greenland and the Russian Federation. So I then had the opportunity to work with the ICC when I first moved to Alaska and remain in close contact with a lot of friends and colleagues there. So Indigenous knowledge is what I want to focus on today in the Arctic context. And of course, I forgot to set my own timer, so.
I've got you.
Okay, you got me, good. So when I first started working on oil and gas regulation in 2008, the way of thinking about the Arctic was, I was introduced through the world of natural science. And back then, there was still quite a bit of resistance to thinking about other ways of knowing. So I'm going to start with what I've learned about other ways of knowing. And what the map or the graphic you have in front of you is by Carolina Behe from the ICC. Inuit Circumpolar Council has just finished a very in-depth technical report on food security in the Alaskan Arctic, so really only looking in the Alaskan Arctic. And this, to me, is a wonderful picture of ecosystem-based management. I do a lot of law of the sea, marine governance, and so this has been a research focus for several years. And look at all the ways of thinking about food, thinking about a system, thinking about ecosystems, and try to begin to think your way into what would you need to know? What Indigenous knowledge, 10,000, 7,000 years of experience in the Alaskan Arctic would you draw on to think about food security in an incredibly rapidly changing climate? Right? The oceans are acidifying. The walrus no longer have ice to haul out on. They're crushing each other when they haul out on land. And there was a food emergency declared in Alaska 2 years ago, and there will likely be one this year because there are not enough walrus for the island communities in the Aleutians to hunt and subsist on. So we need to think about humans as part of the ecosystem in our Western tradition, but that has always been the understanding of Inuit for food security and for relationship to nature. So you have their description of food security, the natural right of all Inuit to be part of the ecosystem. I know at Vermont, we're better about thinking about humans as part of the ecosystem, but also to access food and to caretake, the right to caretake, the right to protect, the right to respect all of life, land, water, and air. And indeed, the Canadian Inuktitut word for our land, which is an imprecise translation of all of those things, including ice, water, land, animals, people. So there are so many concepts that we try to express with English, with a natural science perspective, that have been understood and lived for generations in the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic. So I put this picture up to offer you a very different perspective of how many of my colleagues think about the Arctic. Right? I was first up there working on mapping the continental shelf, and I learned about the Arctic through the eyes of marine geophysics, or geophysicists, I guess. And they think about the shape of the seafloor, the bathymetry, how far does the ledge extend. You don't see anything about people up there, right? So I wanted to offer, if I can make this, I guess I click it there. There we go. An overlay of where all of the Indigenous peoples of the North live. So starting in Alaska and Canada, this is the Arctic Athabascan Council, group that is represented. So it stretches all the way down to BC, covers a lot of the Yukon, and you will note it's transboundary. It doesn't acknowledge the peoples live on both sides of that Canada-US border. The blue are the Inuit, which span 4 different countries, from Chukotka in Russia, the very small percentages, all the way over to Greenland, which is 88% Inuit. This is an important one. It's the Aleut International Association and the Aleutian Islands. People have been fishing and hunting marine mammals there for generations. The Sami Council are, again, transboundary in the Scandinavian Arctic countries, largely reindeer herders. And the Gwich'in Council International is a smaller subset up here, again, transboundary. So the biggest group is green. That's the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North. And it is the least politically powerful, even though they are spread over the largest geographic territory. And think about why that is. Think about the history of the Russian political system and its suppression of all human rights, and especially indigenous human rights. And I can go into detail on stories there. But so those are the 6 groups of indigenous peoples of the North, totaling about 1.75 million people. There are about 4 million people who live in the Arctic, and of that, a little under half are indigenous peoples. So why did I refer to groups rather than peoples? So the Arctic Council is something that it's a non-treaty-based governing body for the Arctic, governance body. It has no formal authority to require binding agreements of its members. There are 8 Arctic states, starting with Alaska, if you work your way around to Russia, Norway, Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, because of Greenland, and Canada. So there are 8 states. They sit at a table with representatives of the 6 permanent participants, which is the name that everybody agreed would be used for the representatives of the indigenous peoples of the North in the Arctic. In this new, sui generis, unique entity that actually brought together indigenous peoples to sit at the same table with states. They don't have a vote, but they have an effective veto, and they are also the longest standing members of the Arctic Council. It's been around for 20 years. Governments come and go, send their political appointees. The indigenous peoples groups have the longest institutional memory and have very much shaped a lot of the work of the Arctic Council, which primarily consists of scientific studies. So there we are back again with science and indigenous knowledge meeting, and I would say for about 10 of the 20 years it's been around, butting heads. But the permanent participants have been very strategic, very effective in raising the awareness of the importance of indigenous knowledge to many of the issues that we are facing in the Arctic at an even more alarmingly rapid rate of climate change than elsewhere on the planet. So I wanted to just give you a few examples of that indigenous knowledge and wanted really to leave more time just for discussion. So the next few slides are going to be a lot of words. I always keep pointing at okay, there we go. So the Arctic Council is something you might want to pay attention to. The U.S. has been chairing it for 2 years. I just came from 2 weeks of meetings in Maine, which considers itself an Arctic state and has a much more antagonistic relationship with its native peoples than does Alaska. So that was a really interesting contrast to talk to colleagues from Penobscot Nation and hear about real problems in the relationships there. But at the State Department level, which is who is chairing this 2-year portion of the Arctic Council, you can 2-year portion, improving economic conditions and living conditions in Arctic communities around the North. And there's a tremendous amount of similarity of problems of resource development affecting indigenous ways of life, subsistence hunting, freshwater security, lack of plumbing, lack of internet access. So these are problems that we are making slow, steady progress on within the Arctic Council. So I just put that up there for you to be aware that this is a focus right now in the United States. Within the Arctic Council, the way we make progress in incorporating Indigenous knowledge is the same way we make progress in international law, which is getting declarations out there stating principles that we think are important and that we believe will lead to eventually, we hope, to perhaps even legally binding obligations to recognize Indigenous ways of knowing in the same way that we recognize natural science. And anybody who has taken environmental law knows that you can't really have environmental law without, I'll say, the science behind it. But I am looking for the day, and I'm working with others to the day, where you can't have environmental law without the Indigenous knowledge behind it. And we're seeing really slow progress in the Arctic. So the Ottawa Traditional Knowledge Principles were generated by the permanent participants themselves and basically calls on the Arctic Council to incorporate formally Indigenous knowledge into all of its actions. And their response was from the states, right? There's still this interaction between the nation state and the Indigenous peoples. But the minister said, yes, we welcome the recommendations, right? Not terribly forceful language. Instruct the council to take relevant action to implement those recommendations. And I can go into detail as to how that's being done, but it doesn't seem like much, but we're laying the groundwork for there to be formal acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledge. So I work a lot with natural scientists, National Academy of Sciences, things like that, and was just curious to see how they are receptive or not to a system of knowing that many of my natural science colleagues say it's not methodical. How can we quantify it? You don't have ways to double blind test the theories. And in fact, that first slide that I put up does a very good job of saying, no, we do have peer review, if you will, right? If your life depends on knowing the ice conditions and you're going out to hunt a whale, and you decide you're going to go do something different than your elders have done for generations, that's a pretty good form of peer review, right? The challenge is to translate that kind of knowledge into blocks of information that we can interchange between the two systems. But there is pretty interesting work being done on that. And from 97, where the principles were sort of, well, when you go into the communities, make sure you tell people there what your work is, right? Pretty one-sided. And without giving you the text on each of them, we then move to a new era of improved cooperation. And you even see in the title, cooperation between Arctic researchers and northern communities, rather than researchers just going in and saying, here's what we're doing, right? Slow but steady progress. The Arctic and the Anthropocene, for those of you who are interested in really detailed, pretty frightening reports, that's a National Academies publication that makes very little mention of Indigenous knowledge, even though the focus is how are we going to deal with climate change? And if people in the Arctic know anything, they know about how to deal with changing conditions. Minimal mention. I don't need to go into any of these details, but we are seeing more and more acknowledgement of the need of natural science to, I will not say rely on, because none of the statements have gone that far, but to work with and to begin to incorporate ways of traditional knowing into our addressing these enormous problems that are facing us. More words. This is a 2013 article. There are a lot of really interesting legal issues out there. For those of you who want to dig in more, let me know. How do you map traditional knowledge? And there's some really fascinating projects going on around the Arctic, largely driven by the permanent participant groups. And this is a fantastic atlas that has begun to do that. It's an atlas of community-based monitoring. And I'll close with just a really good example of what community-based monitoring means in the Arctic. That's more than, quote, just communities. It's real knowledge over time. So I was at a conference on ecosystem-based management in the marine Arctic at Fairbanks a couple of weeks ago, and a woman from Canada's Department of Fisheries and Ocean stood up, and she said they have been monitoring beluga whale in the Beaufort Sea, which is up above Canada and the United States, for longer than I've been alive. She's 38. They've been doing 40 years of rigorous observations of the health of beluga whales as related to oceanic or oceanographic conditions, but from a traditional knowledge perspective. It's the whalers themselves who are out there doing the monitoring, teaching the scientists from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans what they have known for generations about the beluga. And it's that kind of cooperation that we aim for. So with that, I will stop and hope we have a lot of good discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to both of our panelists. I think we have a microphone. If anyone has a question for one or both panelists. You all just ate lunch, so I know what happens after people eat lunch. Oh, here we go in the front.
So I'm curious, lack of knowledge. Just wanted to know, is there, so different tribes, do they work together within the United States? Do they work together to help the common goal of the tribes?
For what purpose?
Well, for all the purpose. All of them.
Well, what's interesting about Standing Rock is that not that many tribes have ever come together before, and it's over 300 tribes to come together in a formal way. But usually tribes handle their own issues, have their own governments. They usually work independently. I don't know how else to
Jump in a little bit.
that,
Yeah, and so there are 566 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and then there are maybe 100 or 200 more that are not recognized by the federal government, but still exist nonetheless and consider themselves to be separate and independent nations. So if you can picture, if you sort of look at the international community and then put that framework onto the tribes that live in the United States, and some of them, you know, I like the use of the term indigenous peoples because it also encompasses Native Hawaiians and Native Alaskans who don't necessarily consider themselves to be Indians as classified under federal law. But there are so many diverse nations that live within the boundaries of the United States that sometimes it's natural for them to form alliances or confederacies, and other times it's not. And so it kind of depends on the issue, I think, in the context. But it's a massive, massive group of separate semi-sovereign nations.
And of those 546? 66, 229 are in Alaska, which a lot of people don't realize because they think the tribes don't have authority. But there, I think they probably work together more than outside than in the other 49 states. Right now, looking at of all things, thinking of putting land back into trust, but that's a
dicey issue. Yeah, there are some famous confederacies of tribes in the Pacific Northwest, in Oklahoma, and then in the Midwest. Oh, and in New York, around the Great Lakes. Okay. Any other questions?
I have a question for Professor Baker about indigenous knowledge. In the Arctic system, do you aware of any discussion about access and benefit sharing under the Convention on Biodiversity? And because I think because the Nagoya Protocol has been took effect, I think 2 years ago, and then many nations is developing kind of a regime on assessing and benefit sharing on traditional knowledge and genetical resources, in particular in developing countries that are considering an intellectual property regime on traditional knowledge. Is it any discussion in the Arctic?
There's surprisingly little discussion, but that's a hugely important issue because we have an opportunity now, especially in the marine area, as new genetic and genetic resources are becoming accessible as the ice melts. We have an opportunity to put in place a system that is much more respectful of the intellectual property rights of the various indigenous knowledge holders. So there is something being negotiated under the Law of the Sea Convention, a new implementing agreement called Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. And because it's beyond national jurisdiction, there's some sense that that Indigenous rights in their traditional knowledge are not going to be as affected because they don't have, Indigenous rights aren't acknowledged beyond national jurisdiction. So that it's being negotiated. We'll see how it plays out. But I'm surprised at how relatively little attention is being paid in Alaska. Certainly in other Arctic states, the permanent participants are playing more of a role in those negotiations. So I can go into a little more detail on the side, but it's, I think it'll come to the fore for the Arctic in the BBNJ discussions.
In the back.
So, why is it so hard for nations to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples?
$1 billion question.
All-encompassing question. Is it because they don't want to have reparations for their past wrongs, or I'm just having trouble wrapping the concept around my head about how Indigenous people aren't, it's kind of like piggybacking off of the properties thing, because I know you can't have property rights unless you're a citizen. So what would it take for Indigenous peoples to be recognized as citizens in other countries?
Well, I'll speak to your citizen question. I guess I would consider myself a dual citizen because I am American. I have all the rights of an American, so to speak. I can vote. But I'm also an enrolled member of a tribe. But I can't be enrolled in both of my parents' tribes. I can only choose one. And that's a different conversation, how the United States categorized federally recognized tribal members. Each tribe makes their own criteria of what a tribal member qualifies as. But your larger question, I think we've been the Indian problem since Columbus came here. Like, what do we do with these people that already exist? And we don't have jurisdiction over our tribal lands, like 100% jurisdiction. And federal government, we're not adequately represented, I think. We're under, we're considered domestic dependent nations under the federal government. The federal government is supposed to take care of us. There are fiduciary trust taking care of our land and allowing us to regulate ourselves. So not many Native Americans are even in the federal government, like I've said. So I think it's more of, I think it'll take more time for us to try to regain anything close to what we've given up.
You want to jump in? And then
Well, I think also another important point is that, well, first of all, we unpackaged those issues in an entire class. So it's like 250 years of history that you're talking about, if not more. But the original question is that at the time, it seemed to appease the Supreme Court that this arrangement where the federal government would own the underlying land with not really much of a legitimate claim to it, except a statement or, a charter from a European government that said, we now own this land because we've arrived here. And the fact that there was this right of occupancy that was stated in Johnson versus McIntosh, that seemed to be enough for the Supreme Court to say, okay, there's this dual system of rights and it's going to work out because the federal government will make sure to protect the occupants of these lands. But as we know from the way that history unfolded, that's not what happened. But, that's a very short answer to a really long and complicated question. And maybe you have more.
But a terrific question. I mean, that encapsulates a lot of what many of us work on, and Professor Ferrier could also offer an answer and does offer part of an answer in her courses. So a lot of it depends on the constitutional structure of each of the countries, and the United States, Hillary's already discussed a part of the problem there. So to take Canada as an example, its constitution expressly recognizes the rights of, and this is the language that is proper in Canada, Aboriginal, Inuit, and Métis. So, and First Nation. So those are all different categories of original occupants of different parts of Canada. So as of 1982, there's a constitutional right of recognizing special rights of those different peoples and establishing a constitutional obligation for the Crown, for the government of Canada to formally to consult with those peoples before actions are taken on their lands. As in the United States, as Cedar has said, there's still not full ownership of those lands. It's split out between surface, subsurface rights. But the treaties that Canada has entered into with its Aboriginal peoples and its First Nations are newer than the ones in the United States, the more recent treaties, and they're called land claims agreements. And the respective indigenous populations were much more politically organized. There was much more public sentiment supporting them. So there are things up in Arctic Eastern Canada, like special subsistence hunting rights in ice-covered areas that are part of a treaty. So it's illegal for the Crown to prohibit subsistence hunting there. In the United States, the protections are much less clear, and they are also much less effectively enforced, I would say. And depending on the country, so over in the Scandinavian countries, their constitutions also are trying to struggle with, we're nation states, but the Sami cross all of our borders, and we're welfare states, basically, right? We provide the same level of protections for all of our people, no matter if they are also Sami or if they're Finnish, right? So you don't get special subsistence hunting rights there. And that's a real problem for people whose livelihood is reindeer herding. So it's a fantastic question, and we could spend weeks unpacking it.
Yeah, we do in the spring.
So I just wanted to mention something slightly different. I'm a member of the Uniform Law Commission, and some of you have encountered the Uniform Commercial Code or the Uniform Probate Code, and the ULC is a group that has been around since the, the late 1800s to help states deal with state issues that should be quote unquote uniform across the country. And there are many things like the Uniform Commercial Code. One of the more recent projects that has been undertaken is we have a committee and a group that is now working with tribal governments. And so the question was, what was one of the things they wanted to work on? And those of you who are familiar with Article 9 and secured transactions would be not surprised to understand that that was one of the central issues that they wanted to deal with, because they had to deal with security issues of property, cars, other things on the reservation lands or within their tribal nations. So there is now not a uniform law because there's many different tribes with, and we're having trouble because I'm working on a project on probate codes, and we're not quite sure how to refer to these various groups because some prefer to be clans, some prefer to be tribes, some are nations, and the nomenclature is very difficult. But part of the problem is that we have so many different people with so many different views and so many different concepts, but we have tried to create a model for them. So I'm working on a project, and please let me know if any of you are going to the Federal Bar Association, because my meeting is usually right after that meeting. So, but we're working with a number of observers to try to fashion a probate code that will work to help. And let me tell you, this is more complicated than the Internal Revenue Code, the Air Pollution Code, or any of those things because of the issues that you've identified, which is the different nature of ownership, the fact that the federal government thinks it has certain rights and interests. There's a federal law, and it is really amazing to think about how you deal with cultural and religious objects and how you help people think about those things. And one of the issues we encountered was, well, we don't want to share what we do, because if we do that, then the people who are next to us that we have been historical enemies of would know what it is that we do, and we don't want to let that happen, or we just can't even talk about it. So it's a very fascinating set of issues. And I guess what I wanted to say was it transcends. It's not environmental law. It's not just, maybe the issues that Professor Hoffman deals with, but there are issues in almost every class that you can think of that can be affected by the indigenous knowledge issue. So I hope that people will raise those issues in class or related to classes, and hope to keep the conversation going.
Thank you. We have a question from the Vice Dean.
Hi, Hillary.
Hi.
So I just kind of hearkening back to the question about, why can't we all get along, at some level. And there's deep racism. There's a whole set of issues bound up in that, as you all talked about. But one central thing as I look back through history around this set of issues has been access to resources, and the economic interest in extracting and consuming resources, and having groups of people, as you pointed out, Cedar, that were here, and kind of in the way from the perspective of those European companies and interests. And now, that became American interests and companies and corporations. And now in the Arctic, nation states all fighting over the newly freed up oil grounds. And so so you look through the case law, and it's at every point, where there's an opportunity to rule in favor of a group of people, a tribe, an indigenous people, versus extraction of the resource. Almost inevitably, the extraction of the resource ends up prevailing as the outcome that's favored. And I wonder, this is a kind of a lead into a question for you, Professor Baker, of whether the work of the Arctic Council and the permanent members is there really any hope for success in light of the battles that are framing up as between Russia and Canada and the U.S. and others over access to resources, extracting oil and the like?
Some hope. So Cedar brought with her, as I should have, her copy of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And if I may, thank you. So there's Article 32 that talks about prior informed consent. So I want to read the exact language and show you how it's worming its way into some of the Arctic Council work. And I should also say that a professor at UAA, Daley Sambodoro from Barrow, an Inuit, was instrumental in drafting and getting the UN DRIP passed in 2007. It's a major document. It's not legally binding, though, right?
And it's not recognized by many of the federal courts in this country.
Exactly. However, I just learned the Department of Interior has a task force to figure out how it will be implementing it. Whether that leads to anything is another question. But Article 32 says, and I like it because its original version said ICE. It doesn't anymore. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting those resources, right? Highly controversial, but a law firm in Boston 5 years ago wrote about PIC for one of its clients who was a smaller oil producing entity, exploration and production, saying it's so worth your investment to get that prior informed consent, even if the courts aren't going to enforce consultation obligations the way we would like them to. So I think companies are beginning to see the value of buy-in before the fact. Agencies are really hesitant how they talk about consultation, but there's something called the Arctic Investment Principles that came out of the World Economic Forum, right? And it doesn't point to prior informed consent, but it does include the UN DRIP in its list of resources and references. And on oil and gas, thank you, exploration guidelines developed by the Arctic Council, they parrot that language as saying this is a best practice. They don't so quite so far as to say prior informed consent, but they make clear that we know it's out there, and next version of this, we're going to put the full PIC language in there. So it's a slow slog. And then it always runs into the national legal systems, whether they're going to implement it or not.
Thank you. Great questions. Any last questions before we wrap up? Or are you guys ready to head out? Okay, well, thank you very much to our two panelists, and thanks to all of you who came today to celebrate this important day with us.
Come back next year.